how the are you meant to know which fantasy series to pick up next? There's a billion of them, and most of them are longer than the queue for a dunny at a music festival. I can't solve this problem for you, but I'll help. Tell you what, I'll give you 10 fantasy book series that are sure to make you bust. What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Let's jump straight into number 1. Now imagine John Wick, but with a heavily Eastern influence. Then throw in a dash of superpowered gangsters, and then a bucket of super sharp, dark, and moody aesthetic. What do you get? You get the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. I was actually pretty hesitant going into this series because I generally struggle to enjoy urban fantasy, but not only did this trilogy blow me away, it became one of my favorite fantasy series ever, for 2 major reasons. Number 1, the aesthetic. It's dark and edgy, but also very slick and classy. The easiest way I can describe it, and bear with me here, is that the aesthetic of reading this book is a lot like opening up a brand new iPhone from your penthouse apartment during a thunderstorm. I don't know, I feel like I've used that comparison before, but it just kind of, that is what it feels like. Reason 2 is a lot more important. This series has some of the best character development I have ever seen. We follow a growing cast of characters over a fairly large expanse of time, and Fonda Lee absolutely mastered an authentic and believable growth for every single character. It's wholesome, it's heartbreaking, it's exciting, it's fun, it's tragic, 10 out of 10. This video is brought to you by my own book, Blood for Coins. This is the first story in a new fantasy series called The Saber's Noctum, following 2 coin-hungry sellswords on the run in a world full of monsters, magic, and bloodthirsty bandits. If you love and want more of the shorter, episodic, self-contained storytelling style of series like The Witcher or Dresden Files, then Blood for Coins might just scratch that itch for you. It's available on Amazon as an ebook or paperback, or on Audible as an audiobook if you want to treat your ears. The boys are just getting started. Alright, back to the video. Series number 2 is one that I haven't finished yet, but I definitely think it scratches a very specific itch that a lot of fantasy fans might not even realize that they have. Imagine John Constantine, but with a cowboy hat, at least according to the book covers. If shorter self-contained adventures about a wizard for hire sounds like your kind of thing, then you need to pick up Stormfront, book 1 in the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. I'm about 6 books in, and while I can't say that I've been blown away as of yet, there is something very, very special about this series. It's a very noticeable charm. These stories are absolutely dripping personality. A booze-soaked detective solving mysteries in Chicago might not sound like a unique angle, but if you give that detective a wizard staff and a wisecracking disembodied skull sidekick, it does get a lot more interesting. This series does take a little while to find its footing, but every book has at least a few iconic scenes. For example, just out of the shower Battle Dresden. Series 3 is an obvious one. If you've ever even dipped your toes into the fantasy community, then you know about Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. I'll keep it brief because I do have a full video going over the series so far, but basically the 4 books that are out of a planned 10 books, I think it is, are about as epic fantasy can possibly get. It is a very long series already, like a very long series, so I wouldn't recommend this to new fantasy fans or people who are just kind of into the more lighter side of epic fantasy. But if you think you're up to the task and you think you're ready for an absolutely balls to the wall, action-packed fantasy adventure of cinematic proportions, go ahead, dive into The Way of Kings, and good luck. Series 4 is one of my all-time favorite IPs when it comes to fantasy, and it was a huge inspiration in writing my own fantasy series. It's called The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski. I'm sure I don't need to tell you too much about Geralt the gruff, hunky sword for hire, but if you weren't sold on these books by the Netflix show or award-winning games, then let me say this. There are very, very few fantasy series that so perfectly tie in episodic, self-contained adventures with a much larger and more high-stakes plot. That is an incredibly hard thing to do well, and while the TV show did kind of flop in that department, I do think that the books well and truly gritted their way to a fat W. Series number 5 is the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. If you took the show Vikings, the early seasons, the good seasons, and threw in a ton of giant mythical creatures, you would have a story maybe half as good as these books. Fantasy with a Nordic inspiration isn't exactly new, but I think it's still enough of a niche that it does feel very fresh when it's done well. If you want to read about some of the most hardcore characters in all of fantasy going on a blood-soaked revenge quest, then you should pick up Shadow of the Gods. Number 6 is one that I've only just finished book 1 of 2 in, but I'm including it anyway because so far it is so much fun. I've been saying for ages now that I want a lot more fantasy series that are not afraid to just be fun again, rather than just dark and gloomy all the time. So imagine a bunch of middle-aged, bikey dads. Then imagine that you give them all swords and kidnap one of their daughters. Bada bing, bada boom, you have Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. I will be doing a full review of my first impressions, going into the first book in this series, so I'll keep it short. I love the idea of a group of past their prime band of heroes getting back together for one last quest. And so far, Kings of the Wild has hit an absolute bullseye. The storytelling here, or the narration angle from Nicholas Eames when he's telling this story, is done with a very distinct personality that I think perfectly parallels the gruff, weathered, sellsword dads that we're following throughout the story. A bunch of dudes that are pretty hardcore, but would probably be more at home around a barbecue rather than in a world full of magic and monsters. If I could use one word for this series so far, it would be memorable. I feel like this series will be very memorable. Series number 7 is more of a quick honorable mention. I would say that it's underrated because almost no one on YouTube has reviewed it, but then when you go to like Goodreads or Amazon, it does have quite a lot of reviews, so obviously there's some notable success there. It's called The Everman Saga by Jason Maxwell. The story follows a brother and sister in a fantasy world on the brink of war. The siblings end up being thrust in 2 separate directions, eventually having their own big part to play in the wars to come. The biggest thing I want to mention about this series, about the Everman Saga, is a very interesting magic system. I don't want to spoil too much, but it involves, runes and enchanting, but in a way that I haven't really seen done before. I do have a full video on this series as well, if you want to check that out. Number 8, Del Toro Quest by Emily Rodda. Look, I know it's middle grade fantasy fiction, but I will grow old and crusty on this hill, that hill being that this series holds up. You probably already know about Del Toro Quest, but if you don't, here's the skinny. The heroes lost and the Dark Lord won. That's not a spoiler, that's the premise of the series. Del Toro Quest is about a young man who's grown up within the Dark Lord's reign, and he goes on a very long quest to try and acquire these gems that go into a belt that can help them defeat the Dark Lord and bring peace back to his home. Some notable things to mention about Del Toro Quest is the found family trope is done very, very well in this series, which is easily one of my favorite tropes when it comes to fantasy. It also has some of the most interesting boss monsters that I've ever read about, still to this day. If you are sitting there thinking, I'm too old for this, that's okay, but I would say give it a go. The books are short, you'll live. Series number 9 is a comic series. I haven't read it, but I'm mentioning it because a lot of my friends and my mates absolutely swear by it. So you know what? I'll include it. It's called Saga by Brian Vaughan and Fiona Staples. From what I'm told, it's a fantasy space opera about 2 lovers from separate worlds that happen to be at war. Your classic Romeo and Juliet plotline. While I haven't read it, I can say that the artwork is fantastic, so if I ever happen to land on a pile of cash, I'd be happy to pick up these comics. And comics are very expensive. Series number 10 is a manga because I wanted to include at least one. Fantasy fans do tend to sleep on manga quite a lot because there's pictures. What the fuck, man? Get your ass on. However, if you take a dip into the panels, there are a ton of game changer fantasy stories to be found. I don't think I'll ever be one of those fantasy reviewers that starts reviewing manga on this YouTube channel, but I do like to read it from time to time, just, for fun. And the title of the manga series that I want to mention here is a title that is sure to send a chill down Daniel Green's spine.
Goblin Slayer.
This series has some of the most hardcore and gory action that you can find, and as the name suggests, our hero's sole job is to take down endless waves of goblins, who are not as whimsical and fun as they usually are in other stories. This series has one of my favorite tropes in fantasy, which is the quiet, reserved hero finally opening up over a long period of time to characters that they've grown really protective of. I love that. If you think you have the stomach for it, I would recommend Goblin Slayer. Well, there it is. 10 fantasy series that are sure to make you go, Have you read any of these? Do you have any suggestions of your own? Let me know. Thanks so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, then stick around. You can check out my own new fantasy book over on Amazon and Audible. It's called Blood for Coins if you're interested. Link in the description. Otherwise, thanks again. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.